Hello and welcome to the Equestrian Canada Equest National Health and Welfare Call. My name is Dr. Bettina Bobstein. I'm the co-chair of the Equestrian Canada Health and Welfare Committee, along with Dr. Wayne Burwash. This call takes place monthly and is open to anyone in the horse industry. The call was developed to increase information sharing within the horse industry in Canada on all topics related to equine health and welfare. Please note that the call is recorded and will be posted on EC's website along with previous calls. Links to the recorded call can be found in the same location. Because the call is recorded, we will hold questions until the end, as some people are not comfortable with their questions being included in the recording. We've muted the background lines. We've muted the lines to avoid background noise. If you wish to unmute to ask a question at the end of the call, please press the unmute icon. We have a very compelling speaker today. Dr. Paul Mcgreevy will present on the topic of tongue ties and tight nosebands. It's timely, as some national federations are in the process of revising rules on noseband tightness in horse competitions. Paul Mcgreevy is a riding instructor, a veterinarian, and an ethologist. Teaching innovation. As Paul is from down under in Australia, time change complications required that our speakers will not be able to answer questions in real time. The Health and Welfare Committee members supplied some questions in advance, which we will hear. I hope you find the presentation informative.
Hello everyone, my name's Paul Mcgreevy. I'm a vet at the University of Sydney. I spent most of my working life working with horses, and I was in practice for 5 years, and then I started to specialise in behaviour and welfare. And these are my beautiful Friesian cross stock horses, and I'm very lucky to live in a beautiful part of the world called the Hunter Valley. But I do have an ongoing appointment at the University of Sydney, where I'm Professor of Animal Behaviour and Animal Welfare Science. Most of my work focuses on horses and dogs. Okay, we're going to look at tongue ties and nosebands now, and this is part of an ongoing research study that helps us understand how we do things to horses that they might not want us to do, and also how the world sees that sort of intervention. Because increasingly we are, as horse riders and horse trainers and horse breeders, thinking about something called the social license to operate. I wrote an article, I'll give you a link to this and a number of other links to resources that support this presentation. But in November 2017, I wrote an article for The Conversation, which describes the growing concerns that people seem to have about the way we race horses, and it lays out why we as horse riders and horse owners and horse users, we need to be clear about what we're doing to our horses and why, and how we can justify what we're doing to them. And I'm not alone in this. It was shortly after that the Chief Executive of World Horse Welfare, another veterinarian, Rollovers, presented at the FEI and argued that the equestrian sport should pursue this social license with the wider community. He defined this social license as an unwritten, non-legally binding contract where society gives horse sport the right to operate. And he quite rightly argues that it's all based on trust. This is a process of building trust with society, and trust that horse sport can operate in an ethical and transparent manner. He also noted how important it is to recognise that we are all responsible for cultivating that licence, and he encouraged us to lead that debate. So I'm full of praise for him for kicking that process off. Okay, what I want to do is show you some information about tongue ties, and then we'll go on to nosebands. I think you may see some interesting similarities between the two devices. This is work that's not yet published, but it's been presented at a conference, at an international conference. I will present some unpublished data as well, but this has been presented already. It's work that we did at the University of Adelaide, and I'd like to particularly thank Sam Franklin for her help with this study. Tongue ties are very popular in racing. You often will see this evidence of a tongue tie here, often fairly neat, but in among the other gadgets that we use on racehorses, this is quite common, especially in Australia. The role of tongue ties has been debated since around about 2014. We know that they're very common, as I've said. The reasons for people using them are generally to do with increased performance, so getting more air into the horse's airways, and also stabilising the tongue. Here's a cross-section through the horse's head to show you some of the airway issues that you need to be aware of. Horses are what are known as obligate nasal breathers, so air is travelling through the nasal cavity, past the epiglottis and into the trachea. And this is a very neat arrangement. Horses do not have to open their mouths to breathe. The chief things you need to be aware of is that the epiglottis is critical in this. If it does not hold the soft palate in place, then the trailing edge of the soft palate will flap in the breeze and cause noise. And so if a horse makes a noise, a jockey will often say report back to the trainer that the horse has done that, and this horse may be then a candidate for a tongue tie. How well that is qualifying as a diagnosis of dorsal displacement of the soft palate, which is the condition we're concerned about, is another matter. So classically, dorsal displacement of the soft palate has to be diagnosed with endoscopy on board while the horse is working. So very rarely do you get that full diagnosis. So lots of horses are being dubbed as having that condition without a definitive veterinary diagnosis. This is what happens in dorsal displacement of the soft palate. What we see is the soft palate is overlying the epiglottis and not allowing that pure function to proceed. Okay, let's focus then on tongue ties. They come in various designs. Leather is commonly used. We also see elastic bands and pantyhose or stocking. We've even had reports of people using cable ties, but I'm not sure how true that is. The important thing for people in equestrian Canada to know is that, of course, these are forbidden by the FEI. We're not quite sure why they were forbidden by the FEI. It could have been to do with the damage done. You'll rarely find this in this sort of evidence in a normal horse. This is where the ligature of a tongue tie has actually produced some permanent damage to the tongue. Very rarely you'll see the tongue actually missing in former racehorses, which is quite sad to behold. Putting on a tongue tie, if you think about an elastic band, for instance, there are a number of processes involved. First of all, you have to grab the tongue, put the loop of elastic around it. But of course, horses' tongues are quite slippery and muscular, so they have to be fairly firmly tight on the horse's tongue. So you do a loop around the tongue, and then a second loop, and then you bring the tongue forward, and put a final loop around the whole of the lower jaw. So this has got two loops around the tongue and then a final loop around the jaw, and then it sits neatly beside the bit. In your resource pack, there is a video of that being done with a stocking. So that link that Bettina has given you should send you to a video of a horse having a tongue tie put on. I'm just trying to save time by dodging that link. What we did for this study was we took a number of harness racing horses, standard breds. We had 12 of them. Some had raced, some had not. And they were in a crossover study, so some of them first of all had the tongue tie application, TT, and then went on to tongue manipulation just to see if that had an effect on its own. And others were crossed over, so they started with the tongue manipulation and then went on to the tongue tie application itself. Quick look at the design of the study. Tongue manipulation just involved grasping of the tongue to mimic the application of the tongue tie, and that was used for just 30 seconds. In tongue tie application, we used the commercially available standard elastic tongue tie that's available throughout saddleries in Australia. And that was looped twice around the tongue, as I've said, and then finally around the mandible or lower jaw. Okay. For each of these treatments, the horses were observed for 80 minutes. First of all, with a 30-minute baseline where nothing happened. Then they had the treatment, which, as you know, was either manipulation or tongue tie application, and then finally a recovery period. So we were able to watch how they recovered. Let's have a look at some of the behaviours that were knocked out by tongue ties. Well, if we first of all look at these bars here, these are tongue tie applications. The tongue manipulation is white, so it doesn't show up on here, but there's a clear difference between what's going on when the tongue tie is on and when the manipulation alone is given. So here we've got two treatments, T1 and T2. Both of them caused an obvious increase in gaping, because there was no gaping in these manipulated horses. A bit of gaping after, but eventually it disappeared. Okay, so that's mouth gaping. What about the ears? Here are the ears, and what we've got here is an increase in the pointing the ears back as we go from the first part of the treatment to the second part of the treatment, a little bit afterwards, but clearly these are evidence of increased ear backwards positioning compared to baseline. And so that's telling us that the animals are, well, we think uncomfortable. Ears back is part of what we're now calling pain face or grimace face. We also saw a fair bit of head shaking in the treatment. So again, you can hardly see this, with tongue manipulation is minimal. There's minimal head shaking when the tongue was touched, but when the tongue ties were on, treatment 1 and treatment 2, we could see a lot more head shaking than there was in the baseline condition. What was really interesting is that we had half the horses had a tongue tie before in their racing careers and half had not. And this is fascinating. What we saw was that the horses with prior experience actually showed more head shaking than the naive horses. So in contrast to what we normally see with horses, where we see habituation, this is evidence that they were actually sensitized to the process. Okay. I hope you're getting the idea that when we can barely see something, it's because it's barely there in the manipulated tongues rather than the tied tongues. Manipulated, tied. All right, what about lip licking? Well, there's virtually no lip licking when you've got a tongue tie on, because the tongue can't do any licking. But afterwards, we saw a lot of lip licking. And we call that a post-inhibitory rebound. So during a period of inhibition where the animal can't show a behaviour, we might look for evidence of distress. Heart rates might go up, heart rate variability might go down, eye temperature might come up, and cortisol might rise. But once that inhibition's disappeared, we're fascinated to see how the horses recover. What you can see here is that the horses that had their tongues tied showed an increase in lip licking after that period of inhibition. So in behavioural science, that tells us that there was a build-up in the motivation to show that behaviour. So we can't say that horses just stopped licking their tongues, or licking their lips, I should say, with their tongues because they didn't feel like it. There was actually a build-up. If you compare this amount of lip licking with what was seen in the baseline. So this is very important information. Studying animals after a period of deprivation tells us a lot about what they were missing. Okay, let's move on to salivary cortisol. So that's taking a saliva sample and looking for the so-called stress hormone cortisol. And what we can see in this part of the study was that in the horses manipulated with tongue ties on, we saw a rise in salivary cortisol. It takes a while to show, but it's clear that these animals had a physiological stress response in response to having their tongues tied. So that's due to be published in an online journal shortly, but you can see why we're concerned about tongue ties. There's evidence here that they restrain the horses and cause a stress response. I'm going to show you some unpublished studies from the University of Sydney that involve a survey of racehorse trainers. And just a very brief overview of what we can tell you so far is that dependent on the sport, thoroughbred racing is more likely to use stockings. These are problematic because they do get very thin, very narrow when they're tightened, so they can actually begin to cut into the tongue. So fortunately, the rules of racing are going to try and address this by helping ensure that the width of the tongue ties is standard and doesn't cut into the tongue too much. The standard bred trainers, the harness racing people, seem to prefer elastic tongue ties. They're the ones we can use in the studies because they're a standard size, so we can apply them in a standardised way. We can't standardise the use of stockings. The good news here is that nobody is telling us they're using cable ties. What we did find was that half the respondents in this survey told us that they'd seen either a physical or behavioural complication due to tongue tie use. And the interesting thing for us is that those reports increased if people told us they kept the tongue ties on for longer. Now that could be because the horses are getting a reduced blood flow to the tip of the tongue, and that may be why some of the horses unfortunately even end up losing the tongue completely. Some of you may be aware of how to study blood flow in anatomical specimens. We call that a corrosion caste, and we've got some early studies of how the tongue vascular system responds to tongue ties. I'll just show you a corrosion caste that some of you may well be familiar with. It's of the vascular system in a kidney. So what you do is you inject the blood vessels in a kidney or any tissue with latex, and then you dissolve the tissues around with a corrosion agent. So this is what a kidney looks like. This is showing you the blood vessels through the kidney. This is an image of a tongue that's half corroded, and this is the artery flowing through the tongue until you reach the area where we put a tongue tie on. And you can see that the flow is badly compromised here. We may get some pooling of blood here, but this is what we're worried about, is the lack of flow that operates when a standardized elastic tongue tie is put in place. Okay, and that may explain why we see some fairly muddy, poorly perfused tongues. So that's quite an unpleasant look. If a veterinarian saw a horse with that coloured tongue in a stable, they'd be very alarmed. So this horse is probably suffering from a lack of blood flow to the tip of the tongue. I should mention that the other reason that we're told that trainers like to put tongue ties on is to avoid the tongue getting over the bit. Whether that is a big deal or not, we're not sure. We'd like to consider that further. But you can see that this horse has certainly got a worrying look of lack of perfusion, lack of blood flow in the tongue. There are all sorts of reasons why this photo is alarming for other reasons, I know that. So, the interesting development since we started exploring tongue ties is that they've actually been banned in Germany. So in racing, in galloping racing, that's to say not trots, not pacing, but the gallopers in Germany, now we're seeing the abandonment of tongue ties. And in South Africa, the NSPCA is pursuing criminal charges over the practice of tongue tying. So we can see here that racing is under some scrutiny because of this practice. It stops normal behaviour, it may compromise blood flow, and it's associated with a stress response. Okay. Now let's look at nosebands. We're assured by the FEI that the welfare of horses is paramount, which is very pleasing. I'm part of the International Society for Equitation Science, which involves a number of coaches and veterinarians, and the society has had a position on nosebands since 2012. You can find that position at this address, equitationscience.com, and of course you're all welcome to join the society. We do have the way we conduct our studies often seems to have a focus on dressage, just because we're interested in concepts such as self-carriage and what the horse is capable of doing, and we're fascinated by the way the sport is changing over time. If one compares Alaric with Totolas, you can see a very different sort of frame and way of going, and this is fascinating because we're able now to look at studies over time. A group in the States compared head and neck positions of elite horses in dressage in 1992 and 2008. And what they found was that if you look at the head angle, if you compare the Grand Prix tests at the Olympic Games in 92 and the Grand Prix test in the World Cup in 2008, these data are really fascinating because they focus on collected canter, collected trot, passage and piaffe. And they were particularly interested in looking at the angle of the head, in other words, the flexion at the pole. And BHV is behind the vertical. So this study found that the likelihood of horses being behind the vertical during passage or piaffe was significantly greater in 2008 than 1992. And that higher scores were correlated with head positions further behind the vertical in piaffe in 2008. So if we're told we shouldn't ride behind the vertical, we would expect the scores to reflect that, but they don't. In 1992, we saw head angles behind the vertical only for collected trot and collected canter, whereas in 2008 we saw behind the vertical in all paces. So things have changed. Whether they've changed for the better is arguable. If we're talking about what happens when we apply pressure to the bit and get the horse to flex, we have to accept that we're using pressure on the tongue and the bars of the mouth. And many horses will open their mouths in response to that. We know that, and that's why when we're using fairly strong tensions, a lot of sports will be aware of the effect of the bit on mouth opening. We know from the grimace scales that I've mentioned already that the tongue out and the mouth open are now being recognised as signs of pain. And we know that there's some pretty awful things that can happen inside a horse's mouth. These are images courtesy of a Swedish dentist. He's actually a human dentist, but he now works mainly with animals. Torbjörn is a extremely good practitioner, but he's gone to the effort of looking at where the bits lie relative to the teeth. So these are rather wonderful images of his Icelandic horse with superimposed images of the teeth. You can see the inside, the canines there, the incisors here, the tongue here with this characteristic dip, which is often where the bit sits. Let's see what happens when we put a bit in the horse's mouth and apply pressure. This is what we don't see, but this is thanks to Torbjörn. We've got these amazing images. That's where the single bit is sitting with a double bridle. We've got more furniture to accommodate, and so we're seeing more space occupied by bits inside the mouth and more dipping into the tongue, just because of the volume of the bits. That's important because when we put a noseband on, we've got more apparatus inside the horse's mouth with a double bridle and less space for them to be accommodated. When we put a bit into a horse's mouth, we know that in the best of all worlds it'll just sit there passively on the tongue and the bars of the mouth. If the horse decides to cushion its bit, it will pull the tongue back and cushion itself against bit pressure by pulling the tongue back into a sort of ball. And to do that, it has to open its mouth. So an open mouth is likely to be a comfort behaviour. And if the horse is wearing a loose noseband, then it can achieve that. You can see that the tongue's been balled up here. Another prospect is that the horse can actually seize the tongue between the molars or the premolars, and again that will be a resistance, but the horse has to open its mouth to achieve that. So whether the tongue's bald or flat, open mouth is an attempt by the horse to increase its comfort. These are images derived from studies of horses being radiographed by Hilary Clayton, a rather wonderful colleague at Michigan. Let's look at what happens inside the horse's mouth. This is a section of the horse's head. Here's the tongue, a rather massive organ. Let's see what happens when we put a bit in the horse's mouth. You can see that the tongue is the most likely area to be compressed. And that's because when God made the horse, he forgot to put some space in for the bit. So, the horse has to accommodate the bit by allowing its tongue to be compressed or opening its mouth. If you put a noseband around this, then there is no option. The horse has to expect compression of its tongue and other soft tissues that are lying under the noseband, so including nerves and veins. If you put two bits in, again, you've got more of a problem. So that's might seem obvious, but it's worth noting. Okay, here's our double bridle. It's a first-class lever, so what you feel in your hand is probably something in the order of 10% of what the horse is feeling. So we have to accept that what we feel is not really reflective of what the horse is feeling, especially when we use the levers. And this is a reasonably tight noseband. I think you can probably appreciate that as the horse fights to chew and to swallow, it will probably be pushing against this tight noseband, and that would cause skin damage eventually, were it not for our reliance on padding. So the padding stops those pressure sores that would otherwise arise, and that's why we're seeing padding here and also in the poll. This is to protect the horse from the likelihood of damage from these devices. We're all familiar with the crank noseband. We know our latest studies show that these devices are more likely to be used by people who tell us they get complications from noseband use. So over tightening with one of these devices is probably more common than we realise, and it's associated, from what we can see, with complications such as damage to the skin. We also know that we can see a lack of blood flow in some horses with tight nosebands. Again, like our tongue tie horse, this is probably because of lack of blood flow. If we're crushing the tongue with 2 bits and then tightening the noseband, those bits can't be moved around. So this is the sort of consequence or one of the consequences that we worry about. Paradoxically, when you put a tightened noseband on a horse, it might be more responsive to the reins. Not for long, not because horses habituate to unpleasant things so readily. But when you first do that, you might find that the horse is actually lighter in the hand. We've got some early evidence that that's the case in a paper we presented in 2011. So that suggests that the bits hurt more, or are more uncomfortable, let's say, when the noseband is tightened. So some people will tighten nosebands before a comp and train in a looser noseband because they know that responsiveness is not long-lived. Again, horses habituate so readily that a tight noseband is only going to give you more lightness for a brief period before the horse habituates to that new level of discomfort. Years ago, I tell students that this is me years ago, and my bald spot is nowhere near as bad as that, and this was probably around about the Second World War or before. Students still don't think that's impossible. The little monkeys. We used to see a lot of noseband checking, but we know that's fallen out of favour. The former director of dressage, Trond Asmir, noted that that this was an imprecise measurement because of people having different sized fingers, and as a result, that sentence in the rules of dressage has been removed. So that they used to check with 2 fingers under the noseband, but now they no longer do. The pressures that we are talking about under nosebands as horses attempt to chew or move the bits around in their mouth are quite powerful pressures. A fellow called Vincent Casey has studied this in Ireland, and he with his team looked at the pressure under the noseband with 2 fingers space, and the pressures range from 200 to 400 millimeters of mercury. That's important because in human studies, pressures over 150 millimeters of mercury are considered dangerous. There is concern that can be associated with nerve damage. So these pressures, even with 2 finger space, are concerning simply because the horse is trying to gain comfort and is moving against a fixed band. So in 2012 we did a study looking at the effect of nosebands on eye temperature and skin temperature, and we used a spacing device that's rather like this. This is the ISES taper gauge, and it has been particularly useful in a number of studies because it's allowed us to talk about the space that is under the noseband at this level, which is the equivalent of 2 fingers in a study of adults. This study showed how we measured the fingers of 20 adults, 10 women and 10 men. And we developed this device, and it has been used in a number of studies. A very good veterinary colleague in Limerick, Orla Doherty, led a study that looked at the use of nosebands in various equestrian disciplines, and she used the taper gauge to assess tightness. And if we think that 2 fingers is about right for noseband tightness, measured in the midline of the horse's head, not at the side, but in the midline in front of the horse's nose. What she found, what Orla found, was quite alarming, that less than 7% of horses had 2 finger space. 44% had no space at all, so the taper gauge could not be put under the noseband at all. That's 1 finger, that's 2 fingers, but 44%, slightly over 44%, could not accommodate even the tip of the device. Now that's a worry. These were mainly eventers and dressage horses, but that paper, you can download that paper. I'll put that on the list of resources for Bettina to share. Okay. When you tighten the noseband, you don't just stop the jaws moving, you actually push the noseband against the teeth. So that's obviously of concern if we end up with ulcers. So being aware of what's going on inside the horse's mouth is critical. We also worry about the prospect of new bone forming. So we can get dips and bumps at the site of nosebands, especially in older dressage horses. And there's some evidence of radiological changes in these animals. I'll come back to that in a moment. All right, so if we think that we can check the noseband with this sort of standardized device, more and more vets are appreciating that this could be worth doing, not least because if you're pushing the cheek against the teeth, you're probably going to have to ask your vet to do more tooth rasping. If the noseband was looser, then maybe the horse could have its regular dentition without the risk of those sorts of ulcers, and perhaps the dependence on rasping would decline a little. Who knows? That's another study. We've been talking about this in veterinary circles for some time. This is a paper from 2015. It foreshadowed a study that was published in 2016. I'm going to show you that now. What you need to know is that this was a study with 12 horses that were naive to nosebands. We were particularly keen to find horses that had not habituated to nosebands. In contrast to the tongue tie study, it's not dissimilar, but what we did was 10 minutes baseline, 10 minutes treatment, 10 minutes recovery. And we didn't do a manipulation treatment, so it's just 10 minutes with a noseband at different levels of tightness. So there were 4 different levels, and you'll see these colours on the graphs. So blue is unfastened, red is the conventional area under the noseband, 2 fingers. Green is half that, so 1 finger, half the conventional area under the noseband. And finally, purple is the one you need to watch for. That's no area under the noseband. And I'm going to share with you some data on eye temperatures, heart rate variability, and behaviours. Let's start with behaviour. What you can see here is that this is the baseline, a certain amount of licking. When you put the noseband on, you get a dose-dependent reduction in licking. So you can see here that there's still a bit of licking going on in the unfastened noseband, but in the noseband with no area underneath it, the very tight version, will eliminate licking completely, which may suit some people. Afterwards, we're seeing a rebound. We're seeing an increase in those behaviours after a period of denial. That's that post-inhibitory rebound that I talked about. Here's chewing, and again we can see a dose-dependent elimination of the behaviour. We can't get rid of chewing completely, so it wasn't the tightest noseband in the world, but we do see an increase in those behaviours after a period of deprivation, but perhaps not more than we saw before. So you wouldn't call this a post-inhibitory rebound, but you would call this a post-inhibitory rebound. This is an increase in swallowing. So here we've got low levels of swallowing and then an almighty return, and it's higher than the baseline level. So that suggests that the horses were missing the opportunity to swallow. Who knows, that may be why some horses show a wet mouth in a dressage test. That is a fascinating prospect. We need to look into that closer. And we also looked at heart rate, as I said. This is a standout, as you can see. That was a significant difference. The heart rates increased in the horses with the tightest nosebands. Heart rate variability is an interesting one. That's the next one I'm going to show. Low heart rate variability suggests distress. So again, our purple line shows that the tight nosebands were associated with a radical shift in heart rate variability. Oh, and that was significant, yeah. Finally, we looked at the eye temperature. Eye temperature is a fascinating way of gathering data about an animal's stress levels, because we tend to find that eye temperatures increase when an animal's distressed. The beauty of this is we don't have to take saliva samples, we don't have to take blood samples. We can measure the response with a non-invasive approach, because the last thing we want to do when we're looking for stress is distress the animal. Clearly. So eye temperature peaked in the treated horses with the tightest nosebands. That was a significant difference there. All right. What we can conclude from this study is that tightening nosebands for 10 minutes in these naive horses wearing a double bridle limits licking, chewing and swallowing, and we see a dose-related physiological stress response that's linked to the inhibition of these oral behaviours. But we can't be sure whether that stress response comes directly from the pressure of the devices or being deprived of the behaviour, or both. So that's another study, yet another study to think about. What we concluded was that using relentless pressure to eliminate oral behaviours in pursuit of a competitive advantage may be difficult to justify ethically. So that paper is online, and again I'm going to give Bettina the link. So Bettina's going to give you, hopefully has already given you the links to this study. This paper has been viewed over 50,000 times online. There is a critique in the comments section and a response to the critique. So if you're really interested in this, be assured that we have spent some time engaging with some of the leading dressage riders in Europe to explain why we did what we did and what we think we found. So that's in the comments section online. As I've said, if you're interested in this sort of discussion, then I commend you to the International Society for Equitation Science. Its website recommends that noseband should be checked in the nasal midline, so not at the side of the face. You're not going to find out much information. You could drive a bus under there and still have a tight noseband. But it also talks about the merits of using a standard gauge, and we know that the benefit of doing this could restore traditional practice, allow the best riders to shine. It would be good for dressage and eventing. It would certainly be good for horses, and we'd see less of this sort of ugliness. Since that paper was published, there's been a follow-up looking at horses in Europe, and this was conducted by Hilary Clayton, again, I mentioned her from Michigan, with the chief vet from the Danish Equestrian Federation, Mette Udal. What they found was that when they looked at over 3,000 horse rider combinations competing in dressage, show jumping, eventing and endurance, they found that oral lesions and blood was visible at the commissures, the corners of the mouth, the commissures of the lips in 9% of horses, and increased with the level of competition. And they found that tighter nosebands increased the risk of oral lesions. Since that paper came out, we've been doing some studies in Mexico with the cavalry horses there. A wonderful team of vets and volunteers, volunteer veterinary students have been helping with a study there. This hasn't been published yet, but what they've been looking at is bumps on noses. This is a big one, as you can see, and trying to establish using radiography what those bumps actually mean. So we've got a series of these horses. There are actually over 140 that we're going to talk about in an upcoming paper. So I'll be able to describe where we think we might see a dip and where we might see an increase in exostosis or a bump. And clearly we need a large number of horses to get this sort of information across. Here's another one, slightly worse. And a bit parrot mouth, I think. Look at that, that's quite extraordinary. Anyway, these studies will also involve a visual appraisal and noting where there is evidence of white hairs on the nose. We'll also look at the mandible because if pressure is causing any changes here, this can see where the noseband's been lying. We also need to look at the mandible for changes there too. Since the Danish study, the Danish Equestrian Federation have set a limit to noseband tightness, and it's not quite 2 fingers, but it's probably providing a step in the right direction for those horses. And also we've seen something similar, I think it's 1 finger in New Zealand. So this really fits into the question of what we do to horses and whether we can justify what we're doing. If we can ride them without tight nosebands, then maybe we should. If they're opening their mouths because they're uncomfortable, then that's information that many of us would want the horses to share with us. And it feeds in, for me, it feeds into this discussion, this growing discussion about the social license to operate. Going back to what Rolly Over said, it is important that we recognise that we're all responsible for cultivating that licence, and I hope that we can continue to have this discussion, because on a very small level we could think about the social licence to use tongue ties, or the social licence to use restrictive nosebands. Perhaps that's what we need to do as a next step. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I look forward to contacting you with your feedback. And once again, it's been a great pleasure to be able to present this information to you. And there's plenty more to come, so watch this space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mcgreevy, for this fascinating overview of this issue. I'd like to share some of the questions now that were submitted in advance by the Health and Welfare Committee. Question number 1. Do you feel there have been improvements in the monitoring of nosebands since this was identified as a hot topic in 2017? Paul replies, it feels as though there has been some progress in forward-thinking countries where equestrian federations can see the need to give horses a voice, but it appears that most organizations will not act on any ethical issues observers may have with denying horses the opportunity to yawn, lick, chew, and swallow. They instead demand evidence that the horse pays a physical cost for wearing a restrictive noseband, and evidence that horses do not simply learn to tolerate the practice. It saddens me that demanding these pieces of evidence fundamentally erodes our social license to operate, to impose this mechanical restriction, and even questions our having a voice in how we treat our horses because we're so conflicted by our own interests. After all, it takes a long time to retrain horses that have competed with a restrictive noseband. The evidence of damage done will emerge, but as their own worst enemies, horses will always habituate to aversive practices and make abuse appear okay. Quote, just because you can do something to a horse does not make it okay, unquote. Question, since tongue ties are prohibited in competitions, does racing also look at banning them? Response, Racing Australia has banned the use of elastic stockings as tongue ties, and Germany has banned tongue ties completely in racing. Question, do you agree that the FEI should be leading the file on rules regarding noseband tightness, considering that many national federations follow these rules? Response, yes, but because FEI no longer has a welfare subcommittee, there is therefore unsurprisingly minimal leadership on welfare. Question, after being presented with information and evidence, how receptive are horse owners, trainers, and riders to monitoring and regulation of noseband tightness? Response, the latest paper on noseband practices, that was Weller et al. 220, which we will provide a link to, shows only minimal awareness of the taper gauge check, but is encouraging feedback on where noseband tightness is concerned. And I think what that means is I think horse owners are very interested in this. Question, has anyone looked at the placement of nosebands on the face? There seems to be a trend to adjust them very high on the nose, sometimes as high as the cheekbones. Yes, in response. Orla Doherty reported this in her international survey paper, which is also going to be on the website. At this point, I'd like to ask if there's any further questions from our listeners, either to Equestrian Canada or that you would like passed on to Dr. Mcgreevy, and we will get those questions answered for you. If you wish to ask a question, you need to unmute your microphone icon on your screen. Any questions?
It's Mary Bell. I had the sense from the talk that there are no noseband regulations currently. I don't believe that is true. I think there are, both in FEI and in EC. The measurement is not done in the bridge of the nose, but the measurement, I do not believe, has been removed.
It's from looking at the rules, and I don't have them in front of me, Marion, probably should have, apologies for that. It's a little bit of a patchwork between the jumpers, the hunter jumpers, the eventing people, and the dressage crowd. There's no consistency between them.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Certainly those regulations are available on the Equestrian Canada website, so you can definitely look up the regulations for yourself for all the disciplines that use nosebands. Any further questions? If you, in hindsight, if you would like me to put any questions directly to Dr. Mcgreevy, by all means, email Christy House at Equestrian Canada, and I can make sure that we get you a custom answer to your question. If there are no more questions from our large audience today, which I really appreciate, I just like to thank Dr. Mcgreevy for doing this presentation for us. I'd like to thank Christy House and the Equestrian Canada communications team for putting this together. I know that you've been very challenged with all of the COVID things going on, and I really appreciate that you've taken the time for this. We hope to see you all out again for the next EC Health and Welfare call. If you know others that might be interested in this presentation, it can be accessed and the other recordings through the Equestrian Canada website. Thank you all again for taking time out of your day, and we appreciate your participation.
Thanks, Bettina.